everyone.
Hello. Can you hear
Hi.
me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
We're
great.
we're so happy to see you today, and we're so glad
Good to
that
be
you've
here.
made we're so glad that you've made it to our conference. You're a
Yeah,
guest of
great to be here.
yeah, great. You're a guest of honor, and all our community is really excited to see you. And I want you to meet Vitalii. He is a member of our program committee and your interviewer for today.
Nice to
Hi,
meet you.
Evan. Nice to meet you too.
And I think that we shouldn't keep our audience waited, so I think we're ready to start.
Yeah, so Evan, it's great to see you in person, kind of. So how's the day?
Pretty good. Yeah, my day just started, so I just finished
yeah,
breakfast.
we already spent like several hours listening about
Okay.
your creation. Yeah, and
Oh.
yeah, so let's give it a start probably. And since like it's roughly 2 months, the Vue 3 being released, what do you feel about it? Are you happy? Because like it took a while for us to get here. So let's start.
In general, I'm pretty happy with all the work we've done. We've put into Vue 3. The code base is much more pleasant to maintain compared to Vue 2. But we still had a bunch of ideas that we kind of wanted to finish. Like, I mean, the work is never finished. Although 3.0 is out, it really only means like the new foundation is ready. There are a lot of other things we can then, explore on top of this. Of course, we also have a bunch of bugs to fix, but overall, I'm pretty happy with the release. I just wish we had more time to finish all the migration related stuff, which is kind of a pity. But the thing is, we don't want to block the release for too long for people who are eager to try it out without having to, wait on migration, because there are a bunch of users who just have new projects waiting. They're like, we want to just have a fresh project with Vue 3, which they can totally do now. But for people still on a huge Vue 2 code base, it's probably they'll probably still have to wait a bit. So that's the one thing that I wish we could had at the launch, but we just want to make sure people who are on new projects can access it earlier.
So yeah, as you mentioned, there is a two sides of problem for one who already using Vue and for one who newcomers here. So you're saying that Vue 3 is completely ready for the new project to start from this point and now on.
Yeah, I would say that. So I would say Vue 3 itself is ready for new projects, but I guess one thing you need to be aware of if you're starting now for production is a lot of the potential dependencies. I mean, the official library is ready. Vuex and Vuerouter all have like Vue 3 compatible releases now, but let's say you used to work on Vue 2 projects and you're like, okay, let's see if this library is Vue 3 compatible yet. Maybe it still hasn't been. Maybe they're working on it. So that's one thing you need to consider. But most early adopters are they are okay with getting their hands dirty. If they have a problem that don't have an existing library, they probably just write it themselves.
What would you suggest for those who are using Vue 2 and preparing themselves for migration? Would you suggest to wait a bit, or it's better to start now and fill the gap in the future?
I always suggest using the AddView/composition API plugin to just test out composition API in a small scale. Say like have a certain feature of your product, maybe a new feature written using the new composition API plugin, just to sort of let your team get familiar with it and feel like how it's like to working with a composition API, because once you move to Vue 3, you'll probably see this a lot. So I think that's the best preparation you can get. Otherwise, in terms of migration, there really isn't too much change in how you generally approach Vue, because the single file component format and the build tools almost work the same. So mostly it's just we want to. So if say you're doing a real migration, most of these work will be just like, oh, this API changed, oh, that API changed. But those are really just a bunch of the small things that you have to check. That's why we want to automate this process with a tool instead of forcing everyone to go through this manually.
Yeah, that's sure. Let's talk more deeply about the framework development itself. Like as we mentioned, like it took a bit while. Like, what was the most challenging part developing Vue 3 for you personally and your team?
It's a long process. There were quite a few challenges. I think the first one is figuring out what's the most fundamental performance gains that we can get with Vue 3. As we know, Vue 2 is based on a virtual DOM. So that gives us this interesting possibility of sometimes you can drop the template and jump directly into render functions. So that gives you a lot of pure JavaScript flexibility, which that's what a lot of people likes about React, is like it's really flexible because you just write JavaScript. But at the same time, we also have templates, and we have a compiler step when you use templates. And we are seeing a lot of interesting ways you can leverage the compile step, like in Angular Ivy or Svelte, when you have, or Ember Glimmer. All of these are template-based technologies, and this compile step gives you a lot of information on how you can optimize your app's performance. So that's what Vue 3 did, is we figured out a way to leverage the compiler step, and so that it creates code that's really, really optimized, but is still virtual DOM based. So, which means in a Vue 3 application, you can get extremely optimized performance when you write templates, and the compiler does a lot of work for you. But in times of need, you can still skip the template and drop down to render functions to get the flexibility. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds. Depend on your scenario. That was probably the biggest technical challenge. Other than that, getting all the type references to work correctly is a lot of work. We have to do a lot of type tweaking, type gymnastics, I would say, and then in terms of process, probably the biggest challenge is a lot of the major changes we have to go through the RFCs, and RFC discussions sometimes can be really long and exhausting because a lot of people have opinions, and we have to balance people's opinions. We have to convince people. We have to constantly accept feedback and tweak the ideas. So sometimes I was thinking, if I was just doing this alone as a new framework, I can just I can finish this implementation today. But with the with the whole RFC process and so many users involved in the discussion, we just have to take it slow, right? So sometimes it can maybe take weeks or months before we finally say, okay, this RFC is ready, so we can finally implement it. So that's a whole different process compared to when I was working on Vue in the early days, where I literally just come up with an idea and I build it that day.
There is actually a bunch of questions regarding all these processes, but let's start with the first one. How are you handling this all RFCs? Because more and more people start using the Vue, and more companies depending on that. Do you have kind of company-based list of prioritization based on donation or some stuff like that? How are you selecting what will be the next one?
There's no company-based. There's no priority list, to be honest. So being a sponsor doesn't really give you anything special in terms of the technical side of Vue. So the prioritization is always focused on which feature can benefit the users most in its biggest scale. And people's input in the RFC thread obviously is a big consideration, but mostly they're evaluated purely on their technical merits. So I don't really care who you are when you engage in the RFC conversation. As long as you're making good points, then we will consider them. Even sometimes people can be making good points in kind of annoying ways. They'll be like, "Hey, this is stupid. You should just do it this way." It's tough getting feedback like that, but sometimes if they're really making a valid point, you just have to accept it and move on.
Yeah, that's a tough one, always. I've noticed that you have over like 2.4K commits within last year, which give me a thought that you are mostly involved in the development rather than in code review or other thing. How you organize the workflow within your core team? Who is responsible for
so
what?
Commits is. So if you compare my commits to, say, last year or like 2 years ago, I actually have a lot fewer commits compared to like 2 years ago. I think I have over 3,000 like in 2018 or something.
Yeah, but there's not about the commits itself. There is a graph in the GitHub which shows like what it relates to. Yeah, so this issue or just.
I'm actually spending a lot more time saying RFC comments. So the graph doesn't really show that, right? RFC comments, merged PRs, right? So say I merged I think I merged like close to 10 PRs yesterday, but they don't show up on the graph because those PRs considered to be commits by other people, right? But I have to review them. There's a lot of work in that aspect. So I tend to break things up in cycles. Sometimes I find it extremely difficult to jump from one project to another, or even jump from one type of work to another. Like when I'm trying to write code, I would just focus on writing code that I completely control. Then next day I would say, today I'm going to review PRs. And that's mostly looking at other people's code and merging them and making sure they work correctly. So these are different work modes. So I tend to separate them. If I'm in a zone for one type of work, I try to maximize that by just keep going until I'm like, okay, I'm tired of doing this now. Let's switch to something else. Yeah, and similarly between projects, right? I would focus on a sub-project. Typically, it's a feature-related thing. So let's say I want to get this feature in this project working. I would work on that, focused on for maybe a week or so. Then I switch to another one. So sometimes people will be like, "Hey, why don't you reply to my issue? It's been a week." It's because I was focusing on something else.
How many sub-projects you have currently?
There are a lot. The ones that I'm focusing most on right now is just Vue Core, Vite, VitePress, and some of the stuff that these projects depend on, like Vue Loader, Rollup Plugin Vue. I think I had to juggle between the 4 of them last week, mostly because there are a bunch of changes that are interconnected, which can be quite tough. But those situations are quite rare. Most of the time, it's just one project at a time.
Are you still trying to control where these things goes, like with the community development? Like since you mentioned that you are involved in 4 projects at least, are you still trying to keep your kind of hands with the control over the important things in Vue, since it's becoming bigger and bigger and wider?
Yeah, I actually hand off a lot of things now. Say the router is just mostly Eduardo, and the Vuex is mostly Kia, CLI mostly by Soda. So they have a very high level of autonomy in terms of those projects. They can, I don't actually look at the issue list of these projects on a daily basis now because I trust them to, be able to handle most of the small ones. And we would only discuss when we have high-level design decisions to be made. Say, what's the next major version of UX? How should it look like? And for router, a lot of the changes are just Eduardo would come up with RFCs and he would post them, and he would discuss with the users of Vue router. And sometimes they just go through without me ever getting involved. Of course, I try to keep a tab on what's going on, but most of the time I'm like, okay, this looks good. So, I wouldn't really try to assert too much control onto that as long as I feel it's going in a good direction.
Speaking about the Vuejs, does the composition API literally kills it at this point?
So the composition API can essentially take over a certain category of use cases where Vuex can be an overkill, especially when you have a small to medium-sized project where you're like, it's just me working on this. I know exactly how everything goes. So you can just have a single reactive object as your store, and that's it, right? But when it comes to Vuex, it's mostly about composing multiple stores into a single store, and then each store has its own sort of convention of where code should be, how code should be written, and then it's because the code is written this way, it's easier for us to integrate in the dev tools so you can understand what's going on. So that's most of the benefit that Vuex really provides. And because a certain part of this is kind of redundant with simple composition API usage, we're looking for a way to simplify Vuex itself so it is more focused on providing these benefits instead of like just be able to share state between components. That's no longer a hard problem, right? So so we want to simplify that and make Vuex more focused on team scenarios where you have a lot of people collaborating. How can we write state code in a way that everybody can follow what's going on and understand where code should go when they are adding new features?
That's a very good explanation.
So it's more like a convention layer. Yeah.
Yeah. And speaking about the internal development, do you have a kind of internal style guides for team, or it's depending on the each part of the project itself?
I guess for a public application code, we have the official style guide, which I think we should try to update at some point. Like some of them we might want to update for Vue 3 specifically, but that's still mostly good. Internally, we don't really have a style guide per se. The setup of Vue core is that we use TypeScript and Prettier. So whatever code you write, it gets auto-formatted, and they have to pass all the type checks. So these tools already assert a lot of constraints on how you can actually just write your code. Like there's really few options here. So most of the time, the style tweaks are minor. So we don't try to enforce that too much unless we see something that's really out of place. Otherwise, we don't see a strong need to enforce something that's like, I've tried to use like ESLint with Airbnb rules. They're just too strict. I feel like I'm just fighting the rules all the time instead of focusing on the code.
Yeah, that's a common issue with Airbnb style guide. Speaking about the framework development, which is the most challenging parts you find in framework development? Is it something like API design, performance optimization, or maybe a team communication or other thing?
I think the most challenging is when you have an existing framework that already has a lot of users, already have a lot of history burden, and then you try to do something new. that's extremely difficult because you're essentially to dance with your hands chained. It's like you have all these existing use cases, conventions, resources in the ecosystem. You can't simply abandon them, but still you want to try to come up with something new that still retains the essence of your framework, but so it's kind of hard, right? It's much more difficult than say this is a whole new framework. And that's what Angular 2 did. Imagine if they have to keep Angular 1 users happy while working on Angular 2. That's almost going to be an impossible task, right? So essentially the choice is making it much harder to come up with new stuff, or you piss off all the old users by breaking everything. So that's a very difficult balance to manage. And there's really no easy answer here, right? Because it differs for each framework, like how much you're changing from the past and how much you are trying to preserve or adapt. I think, say, React hooks is a pretty interesting example because they essentially completely changed how the framework works without people kind of realizing it. Everyone was just like super excited and they didn't realize, okay, this is actually turning into a whole different framework.
Yeah, and since Vue 3 literally being rewritten as a framework, may we consider it as an Angular 2 and expect more releases with a shorter period of times?
Yeah, definitely. We want to. So Vue 2 to Vue 3, the whole code base is completely rewritten. So there are inevitably small behavior inconsistencies. But Vue 3 to say Vue 4, we don't plan on doing another rewrite anytime soon. So it's mostly going to be the same code base with, I don't know if we don't really see any strong need for breaking changes at this point. So it's mostly probably going to be very minor stuff going in. I mean, in terms of breaking changes, even if it's going to happen, it's going to be minor breaking changes that you can easily adapt to. Most of them probably could be automated. Yeah, similar to how Angular 3, 4, 5, right? It's kind of the same code base. But sometimes they ship pretty big changes in between those versions. But I think the current code base of Vue 3 can serve us for at least 5 years out. So I don't expect to see big Vue 2 to Vue 3 level changes anytime soon.
Yeah, 5 years. That's a long period in the front end.
Yeah.
And at this point, Vue.js seems like a multi-paradigm framework, like something from here, something from there. Do we still looking for our own way, or Vue already have formulated philosophy? Because since you are the main contributor, you probably should have the answer. So
I think we are going to be so honestly, I think Options API, while being very approachable, the biggest problem with it is once you try to use it for something at scale, it kind of hits a ceiling somewhere. And it's kind of a trade-off because it's kind of intuitive. It's easy to explain to beginners, but at the same time, we believe composition API with some, a certain level of additional compile time syntax sugar can be made easier to work with, even for beginners. So that's what we are trying to see if we can, say, provide a entry path for beginners to start learning Vue directly with composition API, but in a way that doesn't look intimidating. In a way that feels like, okay, I can understand what's going on. And if we can get to that point, then maybe we can converge to, say, the current new script setup RFC that we're proposing. I think it's very promising. So that combined with basic composition API is actually pretty easy to understand, even from a beginner's perspective. So that's my hope. I think, personally for me, a lot of the say, new code I'm writing, we are actually, for most team members now, we are just using Composition API almost exclusively. And I think Composition API is actually pretty unique because even though in the beginning, a lot of people were like, oh, this is just React hooks. But actually, for people who've used React hooks and then they try to understand what Composition API is, they realize it's actually quite different underneath. And in a lot of cases, we don't have some of the weird constraints that React hooks has, say how you need to correctly invalidate the closures so that you don't run into weird stale state. This is kind of a big issue that a lot of like React hooks users have told me about. And I think Composition API just inherently doesn't have this problem because we don't run it on every render. And it just aligns with the standard intuition of like you have a state object, you can pass it around and it just updates. And I think that's actually a pretty good foundation to build on top of. And we are also taking a bunch of compiler-based hints. I mean, Vue has always had a compiler. It's just how much compile time optimizations we can squeeze into it. And the good thing is a lot of these compile time stuff, they don't really affect end users. You don't have to change your habit. It's just really invisibly making your code run faster or just allow you to write a bit less code, but doesn't really change how you write it. So that's what we are kind of focusing on. I think eventually, I think script setup is going to be a good point where we sort of stabilize for Vue 3's conventional usage, and hopefully we can see people sort of start adopting that. But this whole process always takes time, right? That's why we announced the idea like Composition API. We introduced them over a year ago, actually, even way before Vue 3 was even released, right? And we allow people to try it out in Vue 2, just so that early adopters can try it out, give their feedback, and people who initially detested the idea, maybe they'll change their mind over time. It's always kind of a challenging process, but we'll eventually be there. But currently, we are inevitably in a transition period where a lot of people are still attached to Options API, which understandably so, which is why we still support it, and it's going to be here for a very long time. But Composition API we're trying to make it easier to use at the same time, and hopefully more people will be able to sort of see it as the default path.
That's a very, very good answer. Thank you. Thank you, Ivan. And let's talk more about the community and philosophy of the front end in a wider context. I see you had a kind of connection with the React community, with the Dan Abramov and other people. And a couple of years ago, there wasn't connection with the Angular team. Like, have this changed now? Like, do you have kind of round tables with across communities, or that's just a personal meetings?
That's really just a personal thing, because I mean, me and so you probably saw that picture on Twitter, right? Dan, Ken Wheeler, Jared Palmer, and Rich Harris. So we met a bit over 2 years ago in New York, and funny enough, we met up mostly because Dan was in New York. So we were like, okay, it's rare to see Dan in the US, so we should definitely meet him. And it turns out it was just a few days before React Hooks was announced. So that was interesting because we mostly talked about hooks at that conversation, but Rich and me was like, oh, what is this thing? You guys seem super excited about it, but we don't know anything about it. And later on, we realized, oh, this is actually just like a whole new API. And I think hooks definitely to some extent inspired both Svelte 3 and Vue Composition API. not in the sense that we copy them, but in the sense that how component logic can be expressed in a different way we're used to. Because before hooks, if you look at React's class-based API, Svelte 2's sort of reactive style API, and the Vue's object options API, they're all kind of still centered around this concept of a stateful instance, which is this, and then everything is like grabbed off of this, right? I think that sort of opened up this new direction where component logic can actually be just code that isn't bound to a this. It doesn't have to live inside some instance. It can be just code like you regularly write in the module. And I think that's where it kind of started this whole new direction. But after that, we didn't really have any in-person meetings between that, especially after COVID. There's really not much. But we just recently did a podcast episode together without Dan, unfortunately. But it was still cool though, because I talked with Jared Palmer from time to time. He's heavily invested into React, and I'm honestly like I'm always curious about what other frameworks are doing. I'm always open to learn about what cool things they're coming up with, and because I think it would be a pity if like we're like, oh, it's a competitor, we don't want to learn from them, so our users will never get the same good ideas that they're benefiting from, right? That doesn't really make sense to me. So I try to keep an open mind. Even if I'm working on my own framework, I don't want to say this is exclusive or anything like that. I think the frameworks as a whole should be, we are just exploring different ways of tackling the same end problems. And as long as it benefits the users overall, I think it's always good to exchange ideas and learn from each other.
That's a very humble way to see the world. So yeah, I guess it brings benefits to all of us. As a person who are like developing one of the biggest frameworks for the front end, what the framework will look like in 2 years or 3 years in general, like where are we heading as a whole direct, like what is our direction, where we will be in 2-3 years?
Honestly, this is hard to predict, because I'm just working on one of them. So I can foresee that Vue probably wouldn't see any super fundamental changes in the next 2 years, similar to how Vue 2 lasted almost 4 or 5 years. So I think we tend to always think, oh, front end moves really fast. But I think in the past few years, it's definitely been slowing down, and we're consolidating more. Probably we're seeing a new wave of new stuff like Vue 3, Svelte 3, and React hooks. But I think that's going to be consolidated for a period as well. And something to watch out for is maybe we'll see a trend where a lot of third-party component libraries. I think there's going to be an emergence of component libraries that are built with, say, they are distributed as native web components so that they can work with any framework. I think that's a useful. That's kind of the main useful way I see about web components is. If people want to ship a component library that is completely framework agnostic, that's how they would do it, right? That's the easiest way to do it. I think that's going to be a space where we'll see more solutions popping up, but at the end user layer, where when people are getting to write an actual application, I think they're still going to go with a framework because you still need a lot more outside of just web components to orchestrate things. You still need more opinions. So that's where, so honestly, I think 2 years is actually pretty short. I don't foresee any super fundamental changes, but maybe 5 years out, depending on how computing power changes, we are seeing faster CPUs, which hasn't happened in quite a few years. And then we're seeing, WebAssembly and all these things. Something might just pop up and change a lot of assumptions that we make about web performance, and that might trigger a new wave of ideas coming up. But I think the next 2 years will probably be rather stable. Some of the major frameworks, we are just gonna keep evolving. Incrementally evolving things, just improving DX and performance here and there. But it's really hard to predict the future. If I know what's going to happen in 2 years, I'd be working on it now.
Absolutely, yeah, that's for sure. And since it's this kind of competitive thing in the front end, like to select the framework, could you give like a couple of hints why the new developer or the new project have to select the Vue over existing other solution like React, Saddle?
So I think, for a beginner, right? Obviously, if you're a beginner, you want to pick something that is, friendly and easy to learn. So when it comes to learning, you have to consider the documentation, the community, learning resources, and how the API is designed. So I think in terms of approachability, Vue is definitely one of the easiest to teach and easiest to learn frameworks out there. And then at the same time, you don't want to say learning something just because it's easy, but sort of block yourself out of more advanced scenarios, or deprive yourself of potential job opportunities just because the thing you learn doesn't really work in large scale scenarios. So and I think that's one of the things about Vue is, although it's easy to learn, it actually scales, and there are companies using it out there. So so you kind of get this, easy to get into, but once you get into it, you are actually learning a skill that can scale into real production level applications, so that you can actually find a job with it. Right? I don't think it's worth going into too much like technical details. I mean, if you want to go about that, I can ramble on for hours about why like Vue is performant, why Vue is like a balanced choice and all that. But I think for beginners,
it's a pretty good bet.
And a higher, approved high ceiling in terms of scalability. I think that's probably the best argument for you, right? You want to pick something that can keep you going, but also can help you actually get hired.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about since the Vue is Vue core team is connected to the community, and the community feels a lot of RFCs, what is the features of the Vue 3 came from the community, from the outside, and being integrated into the Vue?
There are quite a few. I think quite a few APIs in the whole composition API came from community suggestions. Like when we were discussing, okay, then how would you solve this problem? Right? So people from the community members they will think about how I would use the API that's presented to me and how to solve real world problems. And then they would come back to us saying, hey, I ran into this problem. Maybe we need this API. And we're like, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, we definitely need this. So I think there are quite a few of the whole composition API catalog came from that. It's hard to remember the exact ones, but like say custom ref is definitely one of them. And a lot of these utilities, like checking if something is is a ref, is read only. A lot of these small things, the community just show us with real use cases, and we're like, okay, we definitely need an API for that. And then, it's because we talked through so many stuff, but these are the most prominent examples. A lot of time when we come up with an API, say in the latest one, say the in the SFC example where we are proposing a way to inject state-based CSS variables into the style section of your single file components. I actually completely reworked the proposal because of the feedback. Like the feedback just made me realize, okay, like these are the problems that this previous version of the proposal completely did fail to address. So I just went back and completely reworked everything. And the new proposal is just so much better because of the feedback we got. So I think, so in that way, like I'd say I didn't come up with this idea. It's like a collaborative process. Like we work together on that thing.
And as a Ukrainian community, how can we help become Vue a better? Hard to say.
There are so many ways. I mean, in a lot of ways, just hosting events like this is obviously, getting the community together and share ideas. For me to be able to share these ideas with the community, it's already really helpful. As individuals, the easiest way to get engaged is just, check out issues, help us triage some of them, because we are always sort of at a bandwidth, like we never have enough time to like look at everything, right? So any work that help us can address the problems faster will help. Say you have an issue and sometimes even if you may not be able to fix the issue outright, you can still say, I spent maybe a couple hours digging into this. Here's what I found. It probably has to do with this line of code, right? That might have already saved me maybe half an hour trying to figure out where the problematic code is, right? So I can directly jump into fixing it instead of figuring out, oh, what is going on here, right? So so anything like that actually helps quite a bit. So because as maintainers, we are sort of the bottleneck in terms of the whole how fast things can move. So but contributors and community members, we are distributed, right? If everyone contribute say 1 hour and saves me 10 minutes, maybe you can like save me a whole day, worth just, having 10 people doing the same kind of thing, right? So all of these things adds up and scales. So
that's great advice, actually. I think we may really use it. Out of curiosity, I also noticed on the GitHub that you recently started to sponsor some developers. Is it a strategic one? Yeah, or like how are you selecting those who you will be sponsoring?
It's kind of we don't really have a really strict, so these sponsorships are completely out of my personal, it's my personal sponsorships. It's more like my way of saying thank you, because some of our team members are working on really challenging stuff and doing just a lot of incredible work. It's because if we go through official channels, it's always difficult because our team members, they're not full-time, so it's not like you can say this is your salary or anything like that. When it comes to open source and money, it's always kind of tough to say what is considered fair. So my personal sponsorships really, I don't want people to take it as, say, like I consider one type of work more important than the other. It's really more like one day I was like, this is really important work, and I realized I'm not sponsoring him, so I should probably do it. There's really not too much meaning carried behind it. It's just my personal appreciation.
Guys?
Yes.
Oh, yes. You're back.
Oh, good. Yeah, we are heading to the end of the my list questions. Like for the developers, like what you expect, like how deep the developer should go to work with the Vue? should we get into internals, or is it just enough to know the public APIs?
Depends on what most of your work is. If you're working on, say, a user-facing application most of the time, then it's totally fine just knowing the APIs, knowing how to use them. As long as you feel comfortable using them, you should be good. If a framework requires a user to know its internals to be able to just use it for daily work, I think that's not good design, right? But if you're, say, you're the architect, you're a library author, you want to write something utilities that's reusable for other people to use, then it definitely helps to understand the internals, because you'll run into all kinds of edge cases and, like, because once you ship something for other people to use, they will use it in unpredictable ways. And that's when you start to run into all kinds of weird scenarios, which you really need to understand the internals to be able to solve. So I think that's where the general advice is, depends on what you're working on most of the time.
Okay. And the question is regarding, it just flew out of the mind. Oh, we lost it. Yeah, so I'm going to check if we have other questions from the community as well. And here we go. Oh, I think that's pretty it. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time. It was very exciting to meet you. And yeah, I've got answers to nearly all of my questions here. And yeah,
Great questions,
good luck.
by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Evan, for your limitless answers, and thank you, Vitalii, for your questions. Evan, it was amazing to see you here, and we hope to see you in the next following years offline at our next Vuejs Fwdays conference in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Probably.
I really miss traveling.
Oh, yeah,
So,
I can tell. We all here can tell, actually. I guess by that time you will be talking about Vue.js 4, probably.
I don't know. Maybe.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. It was an honor to see you here.
Thank you all.